Welcome, Brenda, to the Happier at Work podcast. I'm absolutely delighted to have you as my guest today. Would you like to give a little bit of background for you and how you got to where you are today in your career?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so very much. I am Brenda, the HR lady. I'm based out of the East Coast here in the United States, over in the Virginia Beach area. And I have a dog that's in the room with me who's being exceptionally naughty right now. So if I start growling, literally, it's not at anybody else other than him. So no, I got started in human resources about 23 years ago. I didn't know what it was that I wanted to do. I actually wound up writing about it in a book that's called Best Practices in Human Resources: How to Claw Your Way from Wannabe to VP. And it's actually out on Amazon. It became a bestseller when it launched, which was pretty fantastic. Excited about
Amazing.
that. But in the book, I talk a lot about how I came up, just personally, professionally, and then I share those extra tips as well. So you can't miss it. It's this obnoxiously pink book. You'll find it. You'll see it the moment that you're like, oh, there it is. You can find me on Brenda the HR Lady over on Amazon, and it'll pop up. But I actually started off working in a Fortune 500 company, and this was my third Fortune 500 company that I worked for when I started really taking an interest in human resources and what exactly that meant. And I had a boss who was exceptionally supportive and really helped me get into the groove, really challenged me as a critical thinker. And I said, hey man, I had some really, really great leaders around me to where I would literally just dial in and listen to everything that they'd say. I would, if they were talking about a book or sharing a book, I would go grab a copy of it and I would read the same things that they would read. And that's really how I learned how to be very successful at what I did. And it's a combination. Stop.
For anyone not on video, we've got a dog right? Joining us.
This combination of, leadership and HR combined together. And it's not so much, it's never a black and white industry to be in. It's always about, okay, so what do we need to do to figure out what's doing the best interest of the business and what's in the best interest of the people and what's in best interest of the employees. Some days it tips in one favor and other days it tips in the other direction, but that's the constant challenge on how we can actually make the workplace a better place to work and, get the people side of the business right the first time around.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I'm all about here with the Happier at Work podcast. It is about creating better workplaces, but it's really interesting what you're saying about, I don't have a background in HR. That's not my background. My background is very much more commercial on the leadership side of things. Mm-hmm. And so I'm interested when people say and when people talk about HR and how HR is, the perception is that it's a cost to the business as opposed to bringing a huge amount of benefit, or as opposed to like having a really people-centric approach. This is what I'm hearing from the people that I connect with who work in HR. And so it's interesting what you're saying about bringing HR and leadership almost together. And It's the people and the business side of things, which I think is a really, really great approach, because I never had that impression about HR before, where it's seen as this kind of almost separate thing where you've got the marketing leaders, you've got the finance leaders who are all contributing to the business, and then separately you have the HR, which is seen as this cost to the business and it's not necessarily adding the value. Any thoughts to share around that, or your own observations or perceptions of that?
Yeah, and HR today is, when you look at a business that is really growing into its own market, that is expanding, and really working to make its mark in its industry and its niche and its marketplace, right? Really, HR it's not so much administrative anymore. That part still exists, right? We still have laws that we have to follow. We still have compliance. Look, the thing is, the government is not going to descend on you with a bunch of, special operators fast roping down on top of your building if your compliance is not in right. That's not how it works. But getting part of the people side of your business right the first time means that you do have somebody in seat who understands what needs to be done you support what needs to be done. And once it's set up, once it's established, and once it's effective and it's continuing to move forward, then it gives you more latitude to really work on how can HR advance the people side of the business, right?
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of leaders want to get to that part first without realizing that we haven't set ourselves up for success to minimize our risk and our exposure on the onset. And there's nothing wrong with going back and taking care of that and then continuing the path forward. And when HR people when they see or hear something that's out of line, yes, we do teach that. It's important to teach. And I teach a lot of that to HR professionals and to rising professionals. But it automatically hits their call to action button to begin with. And so if we don't address that, they're going to get turned off. They're going to be frustrated. You're going to see them on TikTok saying things they probably shouldn't say, right? Here's an employee secret for you. No, you don't want to do that. So it's really finding that happy medium so that way, businesses are getting the benefit of both sides of that mindset. Right?
Yeah, yeah. No, I love that approach. And so I'm curious to know, what does getting the people bit of the business right the first time, like what does that mean to you?
Getting the people side of the business right, it
Yeah.
means a couple of things. Number one, it's where the leadership of the organization understands that people are its greatest asset.
Yeah.
And it's well worth the investment, right? It's like a house. When, people who are investors in real estate, they go out and they buy a home, they dump money into it, they improve its quality, and at the end of the day, they improve their value. And the whole intention of that is to get their return on investment.
Yeah.
But they don't do the same thing with their people. And the turnaround can be just as fast if you support that. And a lot of leaders are like, well, I don't have the time to put into training. They're just going to have to figure it out.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
you know what? What would happen if your water heater went out in a house that you're trying to get ready for a market, and then you say, you know what? I don't have the time to address the water heater right now. We'll do it later. And then you have a COVID shortage like this, where all of a sudden components like aluminum and copper are not readily available, and you can't find a water heater. Well, guess what? You just set your operating plan back, what, how many weeks, how many months? It's the same thing.
Yeah.
It's just different asset management, right? So when leaders sit and they focus in on getting that, when we say human capital management, it's not just a blanket term that talks about what's showing up on your balance sheet or not. It really talks about, are you taking the same consideration in nurturing and growing and developing the capability and qualifications of your organization and the impact and the effectiveness of it beyond what your bricks and your mortar actually just simply look like, right? So if you don't invest in a house and a piece of real estate, it's just going to degrade. Well, why wouldn't you think that your people would be faced with the same situation?
This is it.
And then you have to start replacing things, right?
Yes.
So
yeah.
It's no different than a home. It's no different than real estate.
So it's getting it right first time. And I have seen this meme as well, which I really like. It's and I don't even know if it's a meme. It's just kind of this, maybe an idiom, where it's like, what happens if we invest in our people and they all leave? And it's like, what happens if we don't invest in them and they stay?
Yeah, I love that phrase.
Yeah,
I love that phrase. But it's so easy to dismiss people, because unlike bricks and mortar and grass and lawn and a garage door and a roof, people do tend to evolve on their own, but they don't do it without a great deal of hardship, and they don't do it without a great deal of animosity sometimes. And so when people, they don't feel like they're being invested, they're going to only be so effective, and they'll get there either on their own or they'll learn something. But you know what, man, how impactful would that be if they just exploded onto the scene because you took the time to support them?
Yeah.
What would that do for your business?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And do you see that people need to be educated about that that's not the common understanding that leaders have, that they need to be convinced and educated that this is the way to go.
I think they need to buy into it. I mean,
Yeah,
I think there are people that are just like, yeah, absolutely, let's get it on. I think those are your high level executors. Those are your high
yeah,
level players, right? They've seen firsthand the value of that investment in time, effort, and money and support. Then you have people that know they've seen it, they know it, but yet it's still not yet a priority for whatever reason. And then you have another group of people that are like, well, I don't want them to, I don't want to put all that effort and time into doing that. And then they go work for somebody else. So I think those really are the three levels that we run into.
yeah, yeah. So you have like the kind of the people who have, they've bought into the concept already, and they don't need convincing, they don't need educating, they buy into this idea. And then you
Yeah.
have the others who, well, they know about it, but actually they're not really willing to do it just yet. They maybe need a little bit more convincing. And then there's the others who are just like, this is
Yeah.
so not worth the effort, because what if I invest all of this time, money, energy into my people, and then they just go and find a job somewhere else? Then
Yeah.
I haven't got that return on my investment. I mean, that's probably an entire conversation for another day, is like how to actually hold on to the people once you've trained them, and how to ensure that they stay. But I know today we're going to talk about how do we get that buy-in, but also building that sense of trust in an organization, which is really, really fundamental, I think,
Yeah.
in creating a better workplace. And part of that, like we've been talking about psychological safety quite a lot on the podcast recently. It really resonates with listeners. I've been getting emails saying, how can I do that, how can I implement that? So maybe that's where, let's dive right in. Like, how do we set up for success? How do we create a trusting environment? How do we get that buy-in from leaders?
Yeah, it really starts with having that man in the mirror moment, because you can't lead without trust. I mean, trust and leadership really go hand in hand. One will always wash the other, for absolute sure. Excuse me 1 second. Stop. Work from home. Uh, so it's all about, first and foremost, is that leaders need to be very clear on what it is that they expect out of their workforce, and they have to communicate those expectations, right? There's a couple of things that employees will respond very well to, and one of them is the fact that they want to be led, not managed. They want to be led. They need to understand what the company is expecting of them. Excuse me 1 second, please. What the company is expecting of them. And once the company has that dialed in and they communicate it, then now the company or the leadership has the ability to hold the employees to that standard. So if they say, we need to have X percentage of turnover or conversion in our sales by this period of time, now everybody knows what the end result is expected. Now it's a way of diving back in and figuring out, okay, so what are the obstacles? What are the conversations? How do we close the skill gap on this? And are we continuing to monitor it? And if people are struggling, how are we going to help them with it? And if they're not jumping in, and if they're not dialing in, and if they're not buying into what we're selling here, or picking up what we're laying down, then how are we going to effectively adjust this? And how are we going to hold to that expectation? Does that mean that we kind of now have to trim some of the fat? And that may very well be the case, but at least the company and the leadership and management, they all have a direction, and it's a common vision, right? And a lot of people have heard that, but there's a lot of other things that go into building trust in the workplace that people may not necessarily have known. And one of the first things is that if you haven't started focusing in as a leader on building trust, well, there's an old Chinese adage, right? The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is to do it today.
I
right?
love that. Yeah. I say that all the time.
Yeah. But and if you realize that you haven't done it, and all of a sudden you're like, oh man, you start beating yourself up. Don't beat yourself up. Just pick it up and go. Right. So there are things that people respond very well to when it comes to building trust. First and foremost, people, we're negative by nature. It's just how our brains are wired. We are negative by nature. And so that means that when somebody all of a sudden overwhelmingly starts giving all these positive affirmations out of nowhere and these sudden compliments every day, and it's just like, what is going on? And it's weird, because if somebody doesn't focus on that before, they've never done it, there's going to be a little awkwardness involved,
Yeah.
which is fine, right? But don't overload and don't overwhelm. Just start gradually and move forward that way. The other thing is that employees are very, excuse me again, employees are very, very intent on real conversations, and they also appreciate somebody who's not afraid to have the hard conversations, the hard, real, true conversations. So when an employee is faced with the reality that there's an issue that's in the workplace and the leader is not willing to address it, they're not gonna trust that person. Right? We have to be willing to address the hard, real issues. And there's an appropriate time to say, you know what, as a leader, I'm not addressing that because that takes us off course of what our business objective is. Totally understand that. But when it's a consistent problem and it's still not being addressed, that's when people start losing respect for the leader. And it can be something as innocent as the leader not knowing that there's a problem, right? Because other leaders in the chain are hiding it, or they're not bringing it up or to fruition, right? So therefore, employees start making up stories in their head, because in the absence of information, we make stuff up. Human beings don't like not knowing anything. It's like dating, right? It's like, if you ever see somebody that dates and the person that they were going to go out, a girl who's supposed to go out with a guy, and he stood her up, or he didn't call like he said he was going to, and all of a sudden she goes through in her head, like, oh my gosh, maybe he's in a ditch somewhere. Maybe he forgot what house I lived in. He lost his phone. He lost his phone. No, he's just not interested. And I was one of those girls, so I can say that way back when. But, it's the same kind of a thing, right? So employees tend to make up a reason as to why something is. The other thing that is extremely important is that if a leader wants something out of their employees, as far as how they execute on a value, or how they live up to a value, I should say, they have to model the expectation that they want of their people. And this is a lot of old stuff. It's been around for a long time, right? But that is key and important. So if a leader is talking about how they want to see their employees, becoming more healthy in the workplace, then you know what? They better work on it themselves, because otherwise it's empty and it's meaningless. And you know what? Nobody's going to trust somebody that's saying something that's empty and meaningless.
Yeah. I talk about values all the time. The research I did last year, and people who've listened to the podcast for a while will know, the research I did last year, part of that was this idea of values and values alignment with the organization. And even beyond that is this concept that whether or not you know what the values are in the organization. So do you have clear values, first of all? But next is are those values actually being lived in the organization? And if they are being lived, is that how people are experiencing the organization? Is that how decisions are made? Is that how behavior is observed? Is that how people are being promoted and rewarded and recognized for demonstrating these values? And it's not enough for leaders to say these are what the values are, exactly what you said, Brenda, without backing that up with how they behave themselves. So if they say transparency is important, fairness is important, but then they're not being transparent themselves, then that goes against what they're saying the values are, and there's some sort of misalignment, and that would lead then to psychologically unsafe, or a kind of an untrusting situation, an untrusting organization.
Yeah, and one of the things that is the biggest, and this is a hard one to deal with. One of the biggest trust killers in the workplace is when leaders do not address a problem employee and they are a top revenue producer.
Yeah, I could talk about that all day.
Yeah, I know, right? that's a hard one, because sometimes you can have a top producer who is highly toxic. You know, they because they know they're a top producer, they feel that they can do whatever they want, or they don't have to adhere to policy, and then they themselves get this thing in their head about, you know, like, I'm a top producer, and you know, they're never going to get rid of me. It's like, well, you apparently have never had me as your HR person, because if you are that big of a disruption, I don't care how much money you're making for the company, guess what, we can train another one of you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and
Someone
that's the
who's,
mindset that I've taken.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. Absolutely, 100%
Yeah.
agree. And I've seen that in a few different instances when I worked in corporate, where there was someone who was very, very good at sales and revenue generation, but very poor people skills. And
Yeah.
he was promoted then. But I mean, to me, that sends a message to other people in the business that we don't really care about the people side of things. What's important here is whether or not you're good at sales and generating revenue, even if you're leaving a wake of bodies, as they say, all around you. You're driving toxicity, you're driving underperformance, and you're driving attrition and all of those things. And I have seen it in a couple of different organizations that I've worked in, where, you know, and it's not the organization as a whole, interestingly, in my view. It's a very particular individual and a very particular team, but that's what's being shown to
Yeah.
the others within that team, is we value this is important, and that person gets promoted, they get moved up the ranks, but it's causing an awful lot of toxicity.
Yep.
Any thoughts on, just because I have that personal experience, and I'm sure other people can really relate to this as well, maybe from both perspectives, as a leader, if you spot this happening, or as an employee, like, how can we address these types of issues?
Right. And you know, it starts with, it goes back to training. It goes all back to developing, right? So when you're looking at your organizational structure and you see a rising star, or you have a top echelon employee, so to speak, then you need to start figuring out, it's like, that person, that's a time clock that's eventually running out, right? Maybe not right away, but at some point in time. So who's going to backfill that volume?
Yeah.
Who are we putting in place to maximize that, right? And you know what? And here's the worst part. If you wind up, you know, bringing somebody in and you train them, and now all of a sudden you have two superstars, and now you've just scaled your business up. Oh, isn't that a crying shame, right? Now let's get somebody else to come in behind them, because now I got two time clocks that are going to start running now, and I don't want to lose both of them at the same time, which can happen. So why don't we get our next top performer in? Oh, yeah. Shoot. Now we just scaled our business a third time.
Yeah.
Darn. Right?
Yeah.
and so the process repeats itself. And so the thing is that when you have somebody that leaves like that, you lose a lot of that institutional knowledge. So the question is, what are you doing? Because that's something else too, is that your people know who's who and who's doing what. And when you're not dealing with those things, then you know what, they don't buy into what you're putting out there as a leader. And that's all about building trust as well. You know, people need to know, and part of keeping the people side of your business right is that they feel comfortable and confident that you are taking care of the people side of business, which means that you're doing everything in your power to ensure that those doors stay open and that you make payroll, because that is a company's number one responsibility. It's not profit. It's not living up to shareholder and stakeholder expectations. It's about keeping that door open and ensuring you can make payroll week after week after week.
Yeah.
That's your responsibility.
And when you have someone in a position of leadership who is toxic and who is seen as, oh, well, they bring in so much revenue, so there's definitely not anything that we can do. We don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to lose this person. They have a lot of institutional knowledge. But at the same time, that person is toxic and they're having an impact on others within the team, whether that's through absences or attrition rates or something like that. Like, what can you do in that situation?
Well, I think it depends. So if it's like an apex leader, like a CEO or president of the company, get out, because you're not going to
Yeah.
change them.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
are who they are, right?
Mm.
And no amount of clubbing them over the top of the head is going to help that out. So, but when you're talking about somebody who's mid-level, ultimately, if a CEO or somebody who's in the executive suite looking down sees that this particular department has a high level of turnover and we don't know why, maybe you want to start checking into what's going on, because especially if none of your other departments have that level of turnover, now you got a real problem. You know, and I mean, I know of an organization that I was affiliated with that had that very same thing, that there was this one department that was constantly turning over, and it was because of the leader, but the C-suite didn't want to acknowledge that, because that person does so much else for the company. Well, guess what? You're going to have high turnover. But here's the thing, turnover is expensive.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's very expensive. And right now here in the US, up until the end of September, you know, if anybody else is on what's called mini COBRA, which is, if it's a small business and under 20 employees, then that employee still has the right to get their benefits, you know, carry their benefits on for up to 18 months. It comes out of their own pocket. But right now, as part of our current stimulus package, an employer can get a dollar for dollar tax credit, which is great. But the problem is that they have to front the cost of that policy on a quarterly basis. Well, if you have an employee who has easily a $2,500 benefits package month after month for 3 months, that's a lot for a business, a small company, to carry on. Now multiply that times how many people you've lost.
Yeah.
If you have a turnover of 10,000, you know, 10 people at $5,000, well, that's $50,000 that you have to come out of your cash flow somehow, just so you can file a form where you now don't have to pay that. But that doesn't mean that the months that you're covering it, that you're guaranteed those sales to ensure that happen. You know, it's just, so that's why it's like, from a business standpoint, if you want to look at it and bottom line it, how it impacts your bottom line is what you got to look at as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think we get mired in the drama of it. We get mired in our emotions of it. And I'm not, you know, innocent of that either. It happens to me too. I'm going through a situation right now where I'm ready to say, I am so out of here. I'm done with this. I can't wait till it's over. You know, I'm just over it. But it's not easy to still perform at the level that you need to perform at when you're feeling that. You know? But totally. When you do it, people trust you because you're not backing out on who you are in their eyes.
No, 100% agree. I'm such a data nerd, so I love kind of using data within an organization to show, you know, this is the cost. So if you're saying on the one hand, well, this leader is bringing in, you know, let's throw out a few numbers, like $100,000 in a year in profits or something like that. But actually what they're driving within the team is underperformance compared relative to other teams, or there's a higher level of absences, or there's a higher turnover rate within that team. And turnover per person is equivalent to this amount in dollars through lost productivity and training and recruitment costs and all of this kind of stuff. And actually you see then, you compare the numbers and you say, well, this person is costing us more money than they're bringing in.
Right.
And so therefore it's from a business perspective, it's worth investing in having those conversations and trying to turn that situation around. And kind of going back to the original point of, it's a trust killer when people don't have those difficult conversations. Like, that is the number one trust killer in an organization, is the inability to address those kinds of issues, especially if you're aware of it and you identify that there is a problem. Any other thoughts around building trust at work, or something else that might have an impact on the ability to build trust? Or if there's any thoughts on how to have those difficult conversations, like what are the steps to take towards having those?
Yeah. So first off, if trust is something that you're starting to just kind of think about and you're starting to really get in, look, know that it is a long road to hoe. It's going to take a while. It's not something that's overnight. you're really going to have to think through, like, who do you really need to focus in and build your trust relationship with? But at the same time, don't get overly possessed about it, because people are going to feel that level of inauthenticity, and you don't want that either, because
Yeah.
that's going to
Yeah.
work against you. So you want your effort to be a benefit and have it as a payoff and not a cost, right?
Yeah.
So know that it's going to take time. Also know that you're not going to hit everybody, right?
Yeah.
There's history that's there. If you're brand new building a company, man, you just got the best opportunity in the world to get it right the first time, right out of the gate. That's fantastic. But when you come in as a leader, and you adopt a culture, you adopt a staff, you know what, you're going to have your share of challenges, and people aren't going to trust you right away. And just because you may have somebody's back in one way that you feel is right, that doesn't necessarily mean that they value the same, you have my back in the same way. In other words, it's not going to look the same for everybody, right?
Yeah.
For me, like me personally, when somebody has my back, that means that, look, if I've stepped out of line, or if I made a mistake, or like I'm dyslexic, so I say funny words and I don't hear it when I say it. Somebody will be like, hey, psst, you gotta, that wasn't the right word,
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, thank you. I appreciate it. And, it's like, I make a quick correction, but it's the people, but that may not to somebody else be having your back. That could be something else, but somebody else who like, they may be, yeah, he's got something to say about it too. They may say, like, for them, having their back is not forcing them to have hard conversations with other people. They want you to do it. Well, you know what? To me, that's not having your back.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
giving you an excuse to cop out. But that person may have other things going on, like their personality don't want to be the person that's disliked. They don't have that level of confidence. They may not even know what to say. And so having their back for somebody like that is really now shepherding them through that process. It's like, listen, you can say this and you can say that, and acknowledge. It's like, look, I know it's creeping you out, all right, but I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't believe in you, and I know you can do this, right? And I had a situation a little while ago where I had two guys that knew each other. They were kind of stepping on each other's toes, and the one that was most upset about it, I said, you know what, let's take a look at what's going on with this other person. So first off, the other person is a man's man, right? He expects you, if you have a problem, he wants you to come talk to him about it. Not go around. He wants direct, give it right between the eyes, tell him what he's doing wrong.
Yeah.
And I said, here's the other piece of it. He's also extremely loyal. He's a very loving guy. He's a good man. And if I were to come talk to him about your concern, he will forever wonder why, in the back of his head, you didn't have the courage to come talk to him about that. That question will never get resolved for him. So you know what? To my surprise, they actually did meet. And what was discovered is that the stepping on the toes wasn't intentional, which I didn't think it was. But what it was is that the person that was accidentally doing the stepping was being approached by other people, not knowing that the other individual was already working with them in another capacity. And what they were trying to do is they were trying to get to an easy answer. So they're going to the other guy. So basically their audience was playing the two of them against each other.
Yeah. It's like a triangle.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
and it was multiple people that were doing this. And so once they realized what was going on, they got it very, very clear that this was an anomaly. It wasn't anything intentional by either person. They still had a really good, strong relationship, and they're like, oh my gosh, she's right. Like, man.
Yeah.
But
if only they had spoken directly to each other and had that difficult conversation, as it might be.
Exactly. And once they started the conversation, it wasn't as scary. And that was the thing that the one said to me. He's like, the one that doesn't like having the bad feelings about himself from other people. He's like, once I started talking to him, it was really easy. I said, yes, because you already have a good relationship with this person. So believe in yourself next time.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what leaders do. That's what real leaders do, is that they help them reinforce, like, you can do this. I know you can't, because you wouldn't be here if you didn't, if you weren't able to.
Yeah.
Just get out of your own way.
It reminds me of this concept of being kind. So I think there's this understanding, and this is kind of a concept that's come up a little bit for me recently, where there's this concept that being kind is being nice, and it's not necessarily being nice. If you're being kind to someone, it can be. And it's not even being cruel to be kind. But it is letting them know what's going on
Mhm.
in order to help them. So being kind is about helping people, not necessarily about being nice and telling them kind of white
Yeah,
lies to their face, when
yeah,
actually what they really need to hear is the difficult truth, and that's the
yeah,
kindest thing to do. So it sort of
yeah.
reminds me of that.
Yeah, it's another form of compassion. I mean,
Yeah.
there's empathy, compassion, like those two are very similar to one another. And then there's sympathy and pity, right? People who are empathetic, like imagine people who are out on a boat ride in the middle of the Atlantic for the very first time ever. The seas are choppy, they're green all over the place. You know what's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
The difference between somebody who's empathetic and compassionate versus somebody who's, is showing pity and owning that person's sickness is the difference between handing them a bucket so that they can throw up in and or throwing up alongside next to them,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
right? That really is a difference. I know that's kind of a gross analogy, but it works. Everybody understands that
I
one.
think people
That's
can
very much
understand that
that's
definitely.
right. Give them the bucket and the towel and ride it out with them, right?
Yeah.
As opposed
Yeah.
to taking it on and now you're owning it and now the both of you are heaving over the side.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It
You're
doesn't
in it
it doesn't
together.
bode well. Yeah, exactly.
Brenda, anything else that you'd like to share in relation to getting buy-in and building that sense of trust within the organization?
No, just know that it's going to take a lot of work. There are going to be days where you're going to be really great at it. And then there are days where you go in and it's like, I got this. And then all of a sudden, pow, you're like faced with the situation. You're like, I did not see that coming.
Yeah.
Okay. The only way you're going to learn how to do this well is just to get out there and do the work and
Mm.
fail, do the work and fail, do the work, have a victory, do it again, fail a little bit later, right?
Yeah.
You're going to get it. And the more you think, like, I've been doing this for a long time, right? So I'm pretty good at the people game. But there are times where I go into a situation thinking that I've got it, and then when I start listening to the person, I immediately have to change my approach in the direction that's going because I learned something.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's being going in with that openness, going in with that kind of awareness. And again, it's this idea of it's small steps. It's having an open and curious mind, but also, and again, this is something that's kind of come up in my feed a couple of times recently. Is and I use the analogy of speaking. So even speakers who are really really good at speaking, they started out as bad speakers. They didn't just start speaking and immediately be really really good at it. It's going to take time, and the way you get better and the way you learn is by making mistakes and reflecting on those mistakes and pulling out what the learnings are from that.
Yep, absolutely.
Brilliant. So the question I ask everyone who comes on the podcast: what makes you happier at work?
It's funny because you warned me about this, and I still haven't been able to figure this out. And I'm literally watching my dog shred a notebook of notes of mine. So this is going to be interesting to clean up. This is what makes me happy at work, even though it totally drives me crazy. Like I've thrown 3 things at him to trying to get him to stop. Because if I move, I'm going to knock this whole stand over. You know what? I think the thing, it's that stuff. It's the fun stuff. It's the rare occurrence. That's the stuff that makes it happy for me at work.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
It's just like have a sense of humor, enjoy life, and don't take yourself so dang on seriously.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
can replicate those notes. I have a lot of Scotch tape. It's all good.
You can stick them all back together again.
That's right. Yeah. No,
And
whiskey. You got a project that night.
And if people would like to reach out to you, if they'd like to find out more, connect with you, what's the best way they can do that?
Oh my gosh, I have no idea what he's doing. He's like ripping something to shreds. I'm easy to find over at BrendaTheHILady.com. I'm on almost all the socials, so you can find me out there. From LinkedIn, you got to find me as my name, which is Brenda Neckvatal, and everything else is Brenda the HR Lady.
Brilliant. And thank you so much for your time today. I really, really enjoyed our chat. I can't believe how quickly it went. It seemed to go by
I
really, really
know.
quickly.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for tolerating Boom Boom over there.
Absolutely welcome.
Thank you.